On December 30th, 2024, the United States Treasury Department sent a letter to Congress that would barely register in the news cycle dominated by year-end political theater. The message was brief, bureaucratic, almost forgettable. Chinese state-sponsored hackers had breached Treasury systems. Some unclassified documents were accessed. No evidence of continued access. Investigation ongoing. Move along. But buried in that dry notification was something far more alarming than most Americans realized. The hackers had penetrated the Office of Foreign Assets Control, the nerve center of American economic warfare. They had accessed the office of Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen. They had stolen documents revealing which individuals and entities were being targeted for sanctions, the evidence justifying those sanctions, and the internal deliberations of the most powerful economic weapon in the American arsenal. For the engineering state, this was not just espionage. This was reconnaissance. We are accustomed to thinking about the competition between China's engineering state and America's lawyerly society in terms of physical infrastructure. High-speed rail versus regulatory paralysis. Gleaming bridges versus crumbling highways. Solar panel factories versus environmental impact studies. But while Americans were busy debating whether California would ever complete its train to nowhere, China's engineering state has been building a different kind of infrastructure entirely, an invisible architecture of digital intrusion, persistent access, and prepositioned capabilities designed not just to steal secrets, but to prepare the battle space for a conflict that may never be openly declared, but is already underway. The Treasury breach, attributed to hackers associated with the Ministry of State Security, was just one thread in a tapestry of coordinated campaigns. The attack targeted the most sensitive offices within Treasury through a compromised third-party vendor called Beyond Trust, exploiting the exact vulnerability that defines the lawyerly society's approach to security, the assumption that process and procedure, properly documented and reviewed, will somehow protect against adversaries who view process as weakness to be exploited. The hackers stole an API key from Beyond Trust's remote support system. With that single key, they bypassed security protocols and gained access to over 100 Treasury workstations, exfiltrating more than 3,000 files. The Treasury sanctioned Shanghai-based cyber actor Yin Kecheng in January 2025 for his involvement. But sanctions against individual hackers are performative responses to systemic campaigns. While Treasury lawyers drafted the legal justifications for sanctioning Yin, thousands more engineers in Shanghai, Chengdu, and Beijing continued their work unimpeded. The breach occurred in early December 2024. Congressional leaders demanded a briefing by January 10th. The investigation continues. The bureaucratic wheels turn. Meanwhile, the engineering state moves at a different velocity entirely. Consider the scope and ambition of China's cyber operations in 2024 alone. Taiwan's National Security Bureau reported that government networks faced an average of 2.4 million cyberattacks daily in 2024. Double the 1.2 million daily attacks in 2023, with most attributed to Chinese state actors. Not over the year, 2.4 million per day, every single day. The telecommunications sector saw a 650% increase. Transportation infrastructure experienced a 70% increase. Defense supply chains faced a 57% surge. The engineering state approaches cyber operations the way it approaches physical construction, with massive scale, relentless consistency, and a tolerance for failure that comes from viewing individual operations as components of a larger system. A lawyerly society asks whether a particular intrusion is legal under international law, whether attribution is sufficiently certain to warrant a diplomatic response, whether the evidence will stand up in court. The engineering state asks whether yesterday's 2.4 million attacks disrupted the target's operations, and whether today's 2.4 million attacks will do better. The pattern is systematic. Multiple Chinese hacking groups, designated by Microsoft with Typhoon code names, operate with apparent coordination. Vote. Typhoon targets critical infrastructure with the goal of prepositioning capabilities to disrupt U.S. systems in the event of conflict. Salt Typhoon focuses on telecom, aiming for espionage and the compromise of lawful surveillance systems. Flax Typhoon targets Taiwan and uses compromised Internet of Things devices to create botnets. Each group specializes. Each builds capabilities. Together they form an architecture of persistent access across American critical infrastructure. The Salt Typhoon campaign deserves particular attention because it reveals the engineering state's long-term strategic thinking. The campaign reportedly began as early as 2022 and compromised at least 9 major U.S. telecommunications companies including Verizon, AT&T, Lumen, and others. The hackers targeted core network components, routers that handle vast portions of internet traffic. They gained access to systems used for court-approved wiretapping, the same backdoors that telecommunications companies built to comply with legal surveillance requirements. This is where the engineering state's approach becomes genuinely chilling. Critics have long argued that legally mandated backdoors intended for lawful surveillance will eventually be compromised by adversaries, and Salt Typhoon appears to confirm that argument. The Lawyerly Society designed these systems with elaborate procedures for judicial oversight, detailed regulations for when and how they could be used, and extensive documentation requirements. The engineering state studied the architecture, identified the vulnerabilities, and walked through the open doors. Salt Typhoon obtained audio recordings of phone calls made by high-profile individuals, including staff from the Kamala Harris presidential campaign and phones belonging to Donald Trump and J.D. Vance. More significantly, they gained access to information about which Chinese intelligence assets American counterintelligence was monitoring, knowledge that allows those targets to evade surveillance. Senate Intelligence Committee Chair Mark Warner called it the worst telecommunications hack in American history. To quantify because much of it is classified and because the damage unfolds over years rather than in the immediate devastation of kinetic conflict. But consider what persistent access to telecommunications networks provides. The ability to monitor government officials' communications in real time, intelligence on which foreign agents are under surveillance, insight into military logistics and planning, knowledge of which companies possess valuable intellectual property and which individuals have access to classified information. Most importantly, the capability to disrupt communications entirely if conflict erupts, severing the digital nervous system that coordinates everything from power grids to financial markets to military operations. This is not theft for profit. This is not even traditional espionage aimed at gathering specific intelligence on particular targets. This is something closer to siege preparation, the digital equivalent of placing artillery in range of critical infrastructure and waiting. The engineering state is building the capability to paralyze the Lawyerly Society's communications, utilities, transportation, and financial systems not through superior technology, but through patient, systematic exploitation of systems designed with process, but not security as the primary consideration. The American response reveals exactly why this asymmetry favors the engineering state. The Biden administration rushed to finish a cybersecurity executive order incorporating lessons from the breaches, but executive orders from outgoing administrations are easily reversed. The Federal Communications Commission threatens fines for inadequate cybersecurity, but the companies face no immediate consequences for breaches that may have occurred years earlier. Congressional committees demand briefings and draft legislation, generating volumes of testimony and proposals that move at the stately pace of democratic deliberation. Meanwhile, as of December 2024, U.S. officials and affected companies had not been able to fully ascertain the scope, depth, and severity of the Salt Typhoon attack, or remove the attackers from compromised systems. Even though the intrusion had been ongoing for months, the hackers remain in American telecommunications networks. The persistent access continues. The reconnaissance proceeds. The lawyerly society schedules another hearing. The contrast with how the engineering state operates could not be starker. When Taiwan reports 2.4 million daily attacks, China does not convene committees to investigate whether those attacks complied with international cyber norms. When American telecommunications companies announce new security measures, Chinese engineers study the implementations for new vulnerabilities. When the Treasury Department sanctions individual hackers, thousands more continue their work under the direction of the Ministry of State Security, which operates with a unified strategic vision rather than the diffused accountability that characterizes American cybersecurity across multiple agencies, private contractors, and overlapping jurisdictions. The engineering state's approach to cyber operations mirrors its approach to physical infrastructure: build at scale, accept failures as data points for improvement, prioritize speed over perfection, and maintain persistent effort over years or decades. Salt Typhoon has been active since at least 2019, demonstrating the patience that comes from centralized direction and consistent resource allocation. No election cycles interrupt the mission. No changes in political leadership redirect priorities. No congressional budget fights threaten funding. The work continues, methodically expanding access and capabilities. This is the invisible dimension of the competition between systems. While Americans debate whether to fund high-speed rail, China is building the digital infrastructure to disrupt American rail entirely. While California studies environmental impacts, Chinese hackers study American network architecture. While lawyers draft regulations, engineers write malware. The engineering state has recognized that in the 21st century, the most valuable infrastructure is digital. The most powerful weapons are invisible. And the most decisive advantage comes not from building faster trains but from the ability to stop enemy trains from running at all. The lawyerly society's fundamental disadvantage in this competition stems from its commitment to process, transparency, and distributed authority. These are genuine strengths in normal times, enabling innovation, protecting rights, and preventing the abuses that centralized power enables. But they create systematic vulnerabilities in cyber conflict. Private companies prioritize quarterly earnings over long-term security investments. Multiple agencies coordinate poorly or compete for jurisdiction. Contractors introduce vulnerabilities through third-party access. Regulations lag years behind evolving threats. Judicial oversight requires evidence and procedure that give adversaries time to adapt. The engineering state faces none of these constraints. Ministry of State Security operations don't require congressional authorization. Companies identified as useful to cyber campaigns receive resources and protection. Technical talent gets recruited from universities and private sector with combinations of incentives and coercion. Persistent access matters more than legal compliance. Success is measured in capabilities built and intelligence gathered, not adherence to procedure. This invisible war will shape the 21st century competition between systems more than any physical infrastructure project. Whoever controls telecommunications controls information flow. Whoever can disrupt power grids holds populations hostage. Whoever possesses persistent access to critical infrastructure can deter military action through the threat of domestic chaos. The engineering state is systematically building these capabilities while the lawyerly society debates procedures for responding. The Treasury hack, the Taiwan attacks, the Salt Typhoon telecommunications compromise. These are not isolated incidents but components of a coherent strategy. The engineering state is not merely stealing secrets. It is constructing an architecture of digital dominance that could prove decisive if geopolitical competition escalates into confrontation. Every compromised router is a future weapon. Every persistent backdoor is a prepositioned capability. Every day that access continues is another day of intelligence gathering and battlefield preparation. America's advantages in cyber capability are real but increasingly irrelevant. The National Security Agency possesses formidable technical expertise. U.S. Cyber Command conducts sophisticated operations. Private sector security firms employ talented engineers. But these capabilities operate within constraints that the engineering state does not face. American cyber operations require legal authorization, policy guidance, and oversight. Offensive actions risk diplomatic consequences and potential escalation. Private companies cannot share information freely due to competitive pressures and liability concerns. The distributed nature of American power, normally a strength, becomes a coordination challenge in cyber conflict. The question is whether the lawyerly society can adapt without abandoning the principles that make it worth defending. Centralized cyber authority might improve coordination but threaten civil liberties. Aggressive offensive operations might deter adversaries but could escalate conflicts. Mandating security standards might reduce vulnerabilities but could stifle innovation. Every solution carries costs that democratic societies hesitate to impose. The engineering state faces no such hesitation. If 2.4 million daily attacks against Taiwan seem excessive, increase to 3 million. If one telecommunications company proves difficult to penetrate, target 10 more. If individual hackers get sanctioned, recruit replacements. The systematic asymmetry favors patient, persistent adversaries over societies that must justify every response through elaborate procedures. We are living through the invisible dimension of great power competition, and the lawyerly society is losing. Not because its technology is inferior or its people less capable, but because its commitment to process and procedure creates vulnerabilities that the engineering state exploits systematically. The bridges China builds may impress, but the digital access it maintains may prove more strategically valuable than any physical infrastructure. While Americans argue about California's train, China is building the capability to stop American trains, planes, power grids, and telecommunications from functioning at all. The Treasury breach should serve as a wake-up call, but wake-up calls only matter if they produce actual changes in behavior. The engineering state is already awake, already building, already advancing. The question is whether the lawyerly society can respond effectively before the invisible war is already lost.